So let's start by setting our motivation. So we develop those minds of confidence, refuge in the Buddha as an infallible guide, as his teachings as a reliable, repeatable, unmistaken path. And in the spiritual guides, we're able to reveal that path like Lama Zopa, Lama Yeshe. We think that the purpose of following that path and getting the result is to expand our capacity to be of benefit. Looking at the existential condition of all kind mother sentient beings, how they, like oneself, deeply wish to be happy and to be free of suffering, but again and again meet with painful conditions. Wanting to lead those sentient beings out of suffering into perfect, uncontaminated happiness, bliss. Recollecting their kindness and thinking now is the time to repay that kindness. Now that I've achieved a perfect human rebirth. And take the essence of that and repay the kindness of sentient beings. So we develop these motivations of refuge and bodhicitta. All right. So as we know, we are on the section on death and impermanence. Does anyone want to address a question or issue from a prior class on the subject before we move on? Nope. All right. So the next contemplation is day 90. And so on day 89, we'd been talking about, really in this section, we're looking at the disadvantages, starting with day 88. We started looking at the disadvantages of not remembering death and impermanence. So day 88, day 89, in those two contemplations that we've covered, it was about if we fail to remember death, we will not remember the Dharma. And then if we hold the concept that we will live for a long time, then we'll have a very difficult time engaging in important spiritual work. Day 90 is an extension of day 89, where he says, as long as that sense of not dying for a long time is there, our practice will be impure. So this is part of course, makes sense that this is part of the traditional Lamrim teachings, and we've seen how this format comes up again and again, the advantages of something and the disadvantages of something. It's a very, throughout the Lamrim, it's a very common technique for reorienting the mind in the right way, a technique that we use in our daily lives for making decisions about what job to get, what car to buy, what house to buy. We do the pros and the cons. And that's what you find as a device in the Lamrim over and over again. The advantages of remembering death and impermanence, the disadvantages of not remembering death and impermanence. And the aspect here that's being highlighted is, before it was about our time, about the hindrances that arise to our practice when we get caught up in the eight worldly concerns, and then we don't have enough time to really engage in important spiritual work. Here, the emphasis in day 90 is on whatever practice we may do. So the emphasis before was on just the amount of practice. Here, the emphasis is on the purity of that practice. And so he says that our practice, whatever practice we're able to put together, will be impure. He says, perhaps we can overcome our reluctance to meditate and no longer postpone our practice, but the energy is not there to make our practice effective. We find our mind is easily dull or distracted or excited, meaning those are the two, laxity and dullness, laxity and excitement are the two, one of the two, or two of the main hindrances for being a good meditator. So if we don't internalize this sense of death and impermanence, then what he's saying is there's a kind of fire, to our practice that will be absent. There's a, just like we saw how our practice changes with the previous topic of guru devotion, and how there's a quality to our practice that is more energetic, more impactful with guru devotion than without. Even you read the same books, you try to do the same contemplations. When you join that with guru devotion, it's fundamentally different. And here, what Lama Zopa is saying is that the same is true with the realization of death and impermanence, that we might put together a practice, but there's a urgency to that practice that will be absent without this constant recollection of death and impermanence. And again, so pure and impure here again is coming back to the eight worldly concerns, wanting praise, wanting a good reputation, wanting comfort, wanting wealth and status and all of these things. When that creeps into, or when that overwhelms, so it can kind of be one of two things: either the practice that we do, when we're doing it or when we're thinking about doing it, we're also thinking about wanting to be recognized for our practice, or our practice giving us a sense of inflated worth. So in those ways, the ego, the self-cherishing mind, mixed with the worldly concerns, is sort of co-opting our practice. And then it's also true that just the emphasis on the eight worldly concerns, meaning that we become really interested in amassing wealth, requiring comfortable circumstances and so on, um, is going to reduce how effortfully, how consistently we can engage in practice, because it doesn't always come easily. Sometimes, we have to, make choices about, do I do this? Do I do that? How do I make time? Given these demands, given, oh, there's this festival, there's this thing, there's that thing, how do um, by festival, I mean, like somebody was mentioning that there's like a film festival in town, and I mean things like that, like not Losar. There's also, but so anyway, um, so just we get wrapped up in things, and so he says we need to get to the stage where we can discard the need for the comforts of this life, just as we discard used toilet paper. Such strength of mind will not come until we've developed a strong feeling for impermanence and death. So, yeah, so I mean, we might think that we've put together a practice, but he's saying we really need to check, and not just, it isn't sufficient that of course it's better, to have a practice is better than to not have a practice, but we also have to check about how pure is the practice, how impacted am I by the eight worldly concerns. Um, and so this is all because, again, still we're in the small scope of the Lamrim, so everything in this section is creating the causes and conditions for us to become a practitioner who cares more about the overall spiritual trajectory than they do about the content of this life. That's the purpose of the small scope. It's to train our minds to make us that kind of practitioner. And like I've said before, it's called the small scope, but that's an extraordinary achievement, to end. So we have to, of course, understand we don't have it now because we haven't mastered the small scope, and we need to be okay with that. We need to, we need not to think, well, um, you know I'm doing something wrong, because that's like saying, I'm enrolling in medical school but I'm not a doctor. Of course you wouldn't feel badly about not being a doctor on your first day of medical school. You'd realize that's why I'm here. That's the purpose of this curriculum, is to cause me to become a medical doctor by the end of it, not on day one. So we have to understand that all of the contemplations of the small scope are designed to establish that reorientation in our mind. And unless and until we master the small scope, that reorientation isn't really going to be there in a clear and strong way. But we can start checking, we can start analyzing our practice and become more and more introspectively aware of where we are, and how we're progressing in that direction. And that's what he's encouraging us to do, isn't to think, oh, I have to be at the end goal, but just where am I, and how am I progressing? How, because we want to make, year by year, decade by decade, we want to be observing progress in the right direction. So with this, we recognize that thinking about what happens after death, and not, as we said, we're not sure. We don't know how it's going to go yet. And thinking about that, and wanting it to go well, developing a real interest in having it go well, is how we start to progress. Because then, like I said before, that's what's going to cause us to want to investigate karma and all of the further contemplations. Any thoughts or questions so far? Yeah.
The way I understand the importance of motivating impermanence and death, as we were talking about, is the motivation to make sure that, if we were to lose everything, the next day, you know, would our practice have been pure?
Yeah, so that's actually what he goes into. So the question from the Gompa was about, the purpose of this topic is because it isn't, these contemplations have been arguing against the false perspective of a definitively long life, that, there's a sort of groundlessness with our lifespan that's just objectively true. Lama Zopa is not making something up to scare us. He's just pointing out what's true. And if we are concerned about that, that's a valid, to be concerned about what's true is a valid concern rather than being concerned about something that you fabricated. So the purpose of this is, given that groundlessness, the purity of our practice, that is what protects us. Given that we don't know, given that we can't rely. And that's actually the next contemplation, day 91, is really where he goes into that in more detail. Because he says the impure mind of permanence creeps in, robbing us of our strength, just as a burglar comes to steal our jewelry. So then the explanation, he says, to avoid the lower realms, we need a positive mind as we die. And we can only be assured of that if our overall mindset is strongly positive. This means we must practice Dharma diligently and continuously. An on again, off again approach to Dharma is useless. He useless is a strong word, but I think, I don't want to, I don't know what he means, but the way that I take that is, if it's only ever, on again. Of course, in the very beginning, we've started, and we didn't start, and then we did start. That's better than staying as someone who didn't start. But in the beginning, of course, there's going to be breaks. There's going to, we're going to find that consistency, that routine, that, that's not going to come right away. And so certainly that period of time isn't useless. But I suppose if it never progresses beyond that, then that's a limitation. We want to see an improvement in consistency over time. If we don't, then that would be a limiting factor. He says, check your mind, catch it unawares. While you are in the middle of thinking about something, stop and ask yourself, am I aware that I could die today? Probably not, he says. Perhaps you meditate on impermanence and death in the evening, but by the time you get to bed and go to sleep, you have that sense of permanence again. He says that is how pervasive the thought of permanence is. That is why we must keep returning to the teachings on impermanence and death again and again and again. We must keep reminding ourselves of the importance of developing the mind of impermanence and death. So, and so again, like I said, I used the word harsh or something, earlier in this, but we also have to keep in mind that really it's Lama Zopa's compassion that is the driving force behind him sharing all of these insights. He's not trying to beat us up. He's not trying to make us feel like we're not doing the right thing or we're not doing it. But he's seeing, it's kind of like a doctor if a doctor has a patient that smokes, they're not going to be like, oh, it's great that you smoke. It's totally fine. Don't worry about it. Like, keep smoking. It's good for you. That would be a really irresponsible doctor. So Lama Zopa is observing, that there are real consequences to the things that we are habituated to, the things that are easy for the mind to gravitate toward and be habituated to, and that it leads us in problematic directions. So it's his love and his compassion that is driving him to have the courage to point these things out to us, even though, you know, if he just said, you could attract wealth if I mean, he would have billions of followers if he just, kind of took an easy, route and said, oh, well, everything's fine and just think happy thoughts. And, but he's really willing to point out the difficult, contemplations and difficult topics, and let us know that, you know, we should try to see progress in these, in this direction. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I do think that for many people that these kinds of contemplations on death can be very difficult. And I can see how particularly fear could play a role. And I was wondering what is some advice for people to overcome this fear so that they can use the contemplation positively.
Aaron, I'll get to your question, but I had a question in the Gompa, but you're on deck. So the question that Bade had was in terms of fear, that that this topic can engender fear very, for many people, and like what to do about that. What is if that's happening, how do we respond? So I think one reason that fear comes, creeps into that is because for us it seems like an unknown, and it kind of seems, and there's um, different philosophical perspectives that we are aware of in the world about the topic, but nobody seems totally sure. And even if somebody else seems totally sure, for us it still kind of seems like a black box, this. And so that uncertainty naturally gives rise to a sense of trepidation. So one perhaps one way of thinking about that, um, that's related to death and impermanence, are the meditations on the dissolutions, um, where you actually do like a dry run for the death process, so you can learn. I haven't read this whole contemplation, so I'm not sure, because that's part of the teachings on death, but the Lamrim teachings on death and impermanence is kind of meant to orient us, about whereas the dissolutions actually come from the Vajrayana understanding. So I don't know if the dissolutions, but if not, maybe we can look at those. If I like I said, I haven't read ahead too far, but I think maybe if we practice the dissolutions in meditation, then we'll get a sense of, okay, well, this is going to happen, and then that's going to happen, because there's the fear that we have now, right? But then there's also the fear that actually arises at the time of death or near the time of death, and that's different. That can be stronger for people, and it could be that a strong familiarity with the dissolutions, at the time of death, when you like, oh, okay, this is what's happening, and oh, okay, I'm seeing this, and I've practiced this, and so that's really why people do the dissolution practice, is so that because there are, it's a dramatic, if again, assuming that a person dies relatively slowly, if a person dies in a very violent way, then the dissolutions happen extremely quickly, and there's no, kind of doesn't matter. You're kind of here, and then you're in the bardo, and you know, oh well. And then and then again, what we have to rely on, and for a situation like that, are the karmic seeds that we've laid down in the mind, because there won't really be a chance to meditate, but we still rely on cause and effect. So that's the other thing that I would say, is that by developing a strong confidence in cause and effect, then our peace of mind, that comes from relying on our practice, comes from having confidence in all of the positive karmic seeds that we're laying down, and then thinking, oh well, even if there's a plane crash or a car crash, you know even if that's, kind of worst case scenario, I have a strong sense of confidence that I can rely on the karmic causes and conditions that I've created. Um, so I don't know if that might be the best I can. Venerable Sangye Kadro in April is doing a weekend on peaceful living, peaceful dying. So that's coming up. Um, yeah, did that sort of. Okay. Aaron.
So I wanted to ask a question, but also I wanted to comment on what you just said right now. I also was thinking like in terms of like the Lamrim is for a person who's already practicing Buddhism in a way and already moving towards like the Vajrayana. So I feel like in a sense, it's sort of like trying to instill like a person to take seriously their practice already because they are aware of what's going to happen. It's like, hey, remember this stuff. It's like you're almost there. You have like, you could achieve this in one lifetime if you really, really tried. So why are you wasting your time? It's the same thing with like the Pure Land statements. Like, yeah, it doesn't make sense if you're already practicing like that. Like you can already go there. Why do that? But my question was also, I know that some practices have the four thoughts that turn the mind, and I know this is heavily connected to this particular material. And I was wondering what in practice it means to have like the right stance towards this material. Is it just that like sense of urgency? Or can I do that wrong? Like if I feel urgently, I do a practice or something.
I think we do. We have to balance our urgency with our attachment to outcomes. So we have to be comfortable with the practice being the practice and not needing a particular result in a particular period of time, because otherwise we'll get discouraged, and we'll think, well, I've practiced, and also we can burn out. You can get lung, and if you push too hard too quickly, then you can mess up the winds, and it's not good. um, that can even happen in retreat. That can happen in a course of like a week or two of people going into a intense situation. Their nervous system gets kind of taxed, and it's not, it goes away, but it's not fun. uh, so, and if you don't stop, it can be debilitating. It can, if you persist with pushing, and you don't take, it can, I've gotten emails from people who were experiencing that, and who were asking me to, like, you know connect them with a lama or someone, and to try to, so it can, we also want to be realistic and balanced, and not, so it can, certainly we can become manic with it, and that's a real problem. um, so we want to be, yeah, we want to just sort of use it to create that sense of consistency, and if we can honestly say, I'm taking my practice seriously, I'm kind of doing the best I can, then great. But if we can say, well, no, I'm not really taking it seriously. I'm really, there's long periods where I'm not thinking about it like at all, then that's something to start course correcting. Um, but yeah, we can definitely um, get too obsessed and have, that wisdom fear can become a neurotic fear, and that's not what we want. Any other questions? So what Lama Zopa is pointing out in day 91 is that this sense of permanence is not harmless. He's saying it's not just a mistaken, because of course we can see objectively that it's mistaken, because we know just as a factual scientific statement that we can die in the next 5 minutes. That is factually accurate. So to have any other view is wrong objectively, but he's also pointing out that it is harmful. It isn't just wrong and innocuous. It isn't like, being colorblind or something. If you're colorblind, then like, you can't, you're wrong about, for conventionally speaking, you're wrong about what is or is not blue. But, it's not a big deal. Like, it doesn't really matter. But with this, if we don't overcome this, there are real harmful implications, which is that at the time of death, we won't have done what's necessary to die with a peaceful mind. We'll have a strong sense of grasping, a strong sense of clinging in the mind, and then, you know, uh, that whole process may not go as well as it otherwise would. So he elaborates still on this harmful aspect in day 92, where he says, without an awareness of impermanence, we are a slave to our delusions. So kind of broadly linking an awareness of death and impermanence as an antidote to giving in to the delusions. So this would be kind of like thinking, in the moment within our interactions, like, if I do die today, do I want, do I want the last thing that this person, remembers about me to be that I said, a terrible thing to them, or that I treated them unethically, or do I just want that karmic seed to not be able to be purified? So there's different ways you could think about it, but this is in terms of like the arising of jealousy or malice, or covetousness, in our actions. We can think about it, you know, do I want that to be how I leave that person? If I do pass away, then for the rest of their life, they're going to be like, on the last time I saw them, they were rude, or they were mean or disrespectful, and that's not great. But then also we have to recognize that, we kind of think, oh, well, there's plenty of time to become different. There's plenty of time to, either purify that mistake or become someone who doesn't make that kind of mistake. But if we died that day, then really there's not. And then we're dying with that karmic seed being quite close to the moment of our death. And that plays a role. Like we've said, how a person dies plays a role in the process of activating the karma that ripens at death. So, and he said before in the previous contemplation, what we're trying to do is amass day after day after day of things going in the right direction, laying down the right kind of seeds, the right kind of actions, so that we have that momentum going into our death. Um, and if that day, and if, kind of all of the days before it, there was intense clinging, intense grasping, intense, um, then that's going to be kind of what we're, going into that with. Um, Not so beneficial. He says if we could see the consequences of our actions, would be a great deal more careful. But we feel that we will live forever and that whatever we do is without consequences. We live our life heedless of the motivation for our actions and are ruled by the mind clinging to the happiness of this life. The eight worldly dharmas or concerns are our boss, and we obey them completely, regardless of the results. We pursue fame, reputation, comfort, possessions, whatever we wrongly see as the cause of happiness. And in doing so, we become increasingly trapped in samsara. So here this is also getting at the truth of suffering, the truth of, and then, within the truth of suffering, you have the suffering of suffering and the suffering of change. Um, so here he's kind of talking about specifically the suffering of change, which is a really impactful realization as we study the Four Noble Truths and the truth of suffering, or true suffering, um, because we think that, again, he says that we think all of those sorts of things are happiness. And from the Buddhist perspective, they're not. There is no happiness there, um, because they come along with their own suffering. And we've probably, I mean, in a variety of classes, that kind of psychological model, I'm sure, has been presented and discussed, where, you start with a agitated state, a state of boredom or frustration, or hunger, something not going well in the mind and the body, which motivates you to engage in some action, to call someone, to watch a movie, to eat something, to find an object, or to remove something from your experience, to engage in an act of pulling a object of attachment into your experience, or pushing an object of aversion out of your experience. And now you're in a new behavior that you were not in before. You've done something. You're now eating something, talking to someone, watching something. You're at the beach, you're at the amusement park, you're out to dinner, whatever it might be. You're doing something that you think is fixing your unhappiness and moving you toward happiness. But whatever you're now doing comes along with its own attendant unsatisfactory condition, which, if you persisted in that one new activity, you would begin to notice. If the restaurant, if they locked the restaurant doors and you couldn't leave, you'd quite quickly, even though, the good food is still there, you're not in any danger, you'd start calling the cops, even, if the movie theater, they replayed your favorite movie and then they replayed it again, like, you would go out of your mind wanting to be somewhere else, doing something else. So all of the objects of attachment that we are motivated to bring in to our experience, they come with their own attendant unsatisfactory condition. Um, so there is no real happiness in objects of attachment. There is, so we're mistaken about that. There is zero actual happiness, because if there was, then the more we engaged in that action, the happier and happier we would become, because we are just absorbing the mind in something that is true happiness. If we were right, we would only get happier and happier, and we don't. So we have to focus on what is true happiness, which is overcoming the delusions, um, actually eliminating hatred and jealousy and ill will and maliciousness and covetousness. And, to the extent that we are successful in removing those from the mind, we do become happier and happier. Um, to the extent that we develop meditative stabilization and hold the mind in subtler states, and concentrate on virtuous objects like love and compassion and generosity and patience. And we do actually become happier and happier. And it doesn't have an end. It culminates in enlightenment. But, I don't know if enlightened beings get happier and happier, but they've reached, we could say if they don't, it's because they can't. They've reached the absolute pinnacle of that, and they abide like that. Um, but until then, but they call it, moving from joy to joy, progressing on the grounds and paths toward enlightenment, actually is genuine happiness. But objects of attachment are not. So,
Venerable, is that why the phrase in offering to ourselves to be given non-samsaric joy in those offerings?
the bliss of liberation, is that what you?
Well, in the sadhanas, where we're in the tantric sadhanas, where there's the offering, and the last phrase is to instill non-samsaric joy.
Mhm.
So there is joy in
Mhm.
your. It's kind of like saying, I can enjoy this meal. I'm offering it to the Buddha field, etc., and I'm offering it to myself to instill instill non-samsaric joy, so that it's not as though you aren't allowing yourself to enjoy the world, as long as you are not attached to that, and that it is non-samsaric. Is that?
I'm not sure, because it could be, referring to, actually, it could be referring to the joy that is experienced only by non-samsaric beings. And so, of course, samsara isn't the world. Samsara is the body and mind. So a person can be in the world and experiencing the world, and not experiencing the world as samsaric happiness. But that's because they have a direct understanding of emptiness. And so I mean, that's just as a technical point. I can't say for sure what that's getting at. Um, it could be that it's getting at the kind of bliss experienced by beings who aren't in samsara, rather, because I'm just not sure that a samsaric being, of course, we do need to make offer, and of course, in Vajrayana, you are training in divine pride and clear appearance, so you're trying to develop that kind of mindset. You're trying to bring that result into the path. Um, so you're trying to um, be someone who can sort of maybe experience things as if you were an enlightened being experiencing them. Um, but it's a sort of a technical, and I can't say definitively what it is referring to, because I don't want to be wrong. I don't want to say something that I don't know. Any other questions? So day 93, Lama Zopa here does bring into this idea of fear. So maybe he has some other ideas. Um, he says, denying death solves neither the problem of death nor the fear of it. So, and like, oh, again, like we've said before, like that's what our culture kind of does. We put the old people in the old folks homes, and we don't really talk about death, and we don't really want to see it. We don't, we want to just kind of pretend it's not, and we're obsessed with youth and de-aging things and creams and moisturizers, and we're just, our entire culture is. And this idea that like, oh, we in the midlife crisis, just get the Lamborghini, just get the, to recapture your youth. And because we're obsessed with that as a society, and that's what we've kind of internalized. But he's saying that's counterproductive, because you can put your head in the sand, as we culturally are all trying to do, but still, objectively, death is coming. So it's like we've all probably had the experience of, in school, like a test, that we didn't want to, that we were concerned about. And so we just pretended that and we didn't study, and we failed the test, because every time we thought about it, it just caused a sense of anxiety. So in that moment, the easiest thing to do was to tamp down that anxiety by going out and distracting ourselves. And that's kind of what he's saying, that like we have to sit with the anxiety, we have to sit with the discomfort and move through it, rather than just that moment of discomfort arising and then giving in to the impulse to do something that calms the mind, that kind of placates that, which would be a distraction. Because ultimately, what we have also, as we've gotten older, what we've probably also found, because that's kind of an immature, as I said, we probably did that in high school and college. um, but what I have found, and what I think we've all found, just in a conventional sense, is that when we actually do what we need to do, that's how we actually, because if we don't do that, unless we get fired or we flunk out, unless there's some like really, we're still going to have that job, we're still going to be a student, the demands are still going to be there. So if we react maladaptively to every one of those demands, and we never kind of do them, that's going to actually be more stressful. That's going to cause things to go poorly. Um, Whereas if we develop a plan, we think about it logically, we break things down into parts, we analyze, we come up with a way of dealing and attacking the issue, and then we actually have less stress in the mind, because we're checking things off the list. And then we have, like, then the mind actually can relax, um, because we've accomplished the things that we need to be accomplishing. So he says, we're living our life in a hallucination, as if we're sleeping, not seeing the reality of life. We see things that are impermanent as permanent, and are shocked when death, the big impermanence, comes. Suddenly, without warning, death is there facing us. Life is gone, and there's nothing we can do about it. Our time to meditate, to develop our mind, has run out. Um, so and then he's saying that we might have strong regret at that time. We might, you know, and that's not going to be helpful. That's not going to um, create the causes and conditions for that to go well. So if instead, we can just see that as, well, that's definitely coming, and pretending that it's not is completely counterproductive. So what are the things I need to do? And then, like I said, then we actually have less fear because we rely on all of the work that we've done. We rely on, all of the practice that we've done, all of the purification that we've done. And we have a strong sense that that is going to protect us as we move through the death process. Those karmic seeds that we've laid down, that will make that go well, that will keep us safe. And Guru Devotion, he hasn't really, but they also say, so he's kind of talked about using our life to do those things, to associate, to associate with virtue, to disassociate with non-virtue, but also refuge practice. That is a strong source of protection at the time of death. Dying with a mind of refuge, they say there's stories about, because there's, as we've brought in Vajrayana and things, and there's complicated, self-generation and all of these things. And we might think, oh yeah, when my death is coming, I'll generate myself as the Yidam and, experience it as bliss. But then there's, we might get cancer and there's all kinds of pain, and, we might be on medication. And a lot of the practitioners, they've said that those plans didn't really work out, that those incredible visualizations, that wasn't really available to them at the time of death. But their sense of refuge is something that they did cultivate, and that they could move the mind into, and that protects them during the time of death. So it's a very powerful source of protection as well. Guru devotion and refuge. Taking refuge in either just the Buddha or one's. So there are different things. But if one does have a teacher, then recollecting them, or if not, recollecting the Buddha. Taking refuge in some object of one or both. And of course, as we've saw, if we do have a teacher, then we see the teacher as the Buddha. So same, comes to the same point. Any questions? Nope. So I think we'll leave it there for today on day 93. Anything that would be helpful? Nope. All right, so we'll dedicate. So again, just recollect your altruistic motivation. Think of the positive energy that has created, and have a sense of offering it and visualizing strongly that it ripens in incredibly vast and beneficial ways for the benefit of all sentient beings without exception. All right. So we'll have class on Thursday. It might snow on Wednesday. I don't know, but we'll have class one way or the other. I don't know if I'll be here, but probably. I don't know. I did hear about snow on Wednesday. We'll see. But all right.